I'm Jack Young, the chairman of the Standing Committee on Election Law. This afternoon we're going to talk a little bit about the process of short-term and long-term observation of international elections against basically three different contexts. First, by looking at the Declaration of Principles for International Observation. Second, to look at some experiences that some of us have had in looking at elections in foreign countries. And third, to consider the observation process against the context of what is done in the United States, both by political and nonpartisan groups as they engage in the observation process, generally in the names of promote and protect the vote, election protection, or the 72-hour program. We are privileged to have with us one of the, probably the founders, fathers, originators of the Declaration of Principles for International Observation and the Code of Conduct in Pat Mallow, who is a senior associate at the National Democratic Institute. For our purposes, more importantly, is the principal author, consultant to the Declaration and to the Code of Conduct. And I thought it would be helpful, Pat, if you could just give us a general overview of how the international principles work, and then a little bit about how you see the international principles playing out in some current elections. Let's take, for example, Afghanistan. Just as something off the top of my head, since Pat has just returned from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Following Pat, Ben Griffin, who's a former chair of the Standing Committee on Election Law, will talk a little bit about his experiences in Georgia and elsewhere in the observation of international elections and international processes. And then last but certainly not least, Dara will talk about the observation process as it works here in the United States as a point of comparison for the development of greater expertise among all of us in the area of observation. So let's again start with you, Pat.
Okay. Well, once upon a time, Jack asked me to write a chapter for the ABA's book on international principles for democratic elections. And I thought long and hard about how to organize these thoughts in a way that would make sense to American lawyers who are looking internationally and then reflecting back, in our own country. That chapter starts with a very simple proposition, which is elections belong to the people. Full stop. And that might be something that sounds rather simplistic, but in a way that the essence of all of that, which is the idea that sovereignty resides in the populace of a country, and there's a contract between them and those who have their authority to govern, derived from that. It's not something that's that simple to implement. And as I've gone through this internationally for now 20 years, and you might guess by the color of my beard and hair, and I've been around longer than that, so I go back to the tail end of our civil rights movement. Really, elections, in essence, should accomplish two things. They're derivatives beyond that, but two things. One is to resolve peacefully the competition for political power. That may not be such a big deal in the U.S., but it does nonetheless underlie everything in the U.S. And certainly in places like Afghanistan or Ukraine or others, it's fundamental, and it's fundamental around the world. The second element is, as we know from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international principles, is to give the people the vehicle through which they express their will about who is going to have the authority to govern. Again, not a very easy thing when you start to unpack it. And what Jack said, I think, is really critical to all of this. This is something that has to be done over a long period of time. I mean, we know from this country the question of voter registration. We know what it means to get on a ballot. That's not a simple matter. We know what it means to be qualified as a political party. there are lots and lots of elements that go into what makes an election something that's real rather than something that's a sham. Not the least of which is whether the citizens understand the choice that's in front of them. So do you get access to information? Or does the government control the flow of that information by owning the broadcast systems and other means of communication? If they do, is there some countermeasure that citizens have in their country that can allow them to have sufficient information to make an informed choice? If you're not making an informed choice, you're not making a free choice. So there are a lot of elements that you start to look into when you're talking about whether an election is for real or not. And they take you to a lot of other related rights, as I just mentioned: freedom of expression, freedom of movement, the qualification for citizenship. If you're in a country like the Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, that underlies the whole struggle for power in that country. If you're in Guatemala, as an indigenous person, what it takes to be able to get on to the voter registry, whether you have birth records and so forth that are required. There are certain barriers that are hidden that if you just look at the voter registry, you won't understand unless you go a bit deeper. So, long-term observation. The second point that I would make, and I'm going to keep this short because there's so few of us, I think we have a good deal to take. The second point that I would make is, if you believe that sovereignty is based on popular will, then the most important thing is that the citizens of a country have their own capacity to ensure electoral integrity. So working with citizen groups in other countries so that they can be better organized, better informed, and have real impact in speaking about electoral integrity and advocating for electoral integrity becomes critically important. And in the countries where I've worked, and it's been more than 70 countries around the world, and the organization with which I work, the National Democratic Institute, and others, what we've seen is there is not, in transitional countries, countries that don't have a long history of democratic and clean elections, there's not a lot of faith in the government to be able to deliver that, either based on bias, control of power, not wanting to share that power, or incapacity. One or the other, or a combination of them. And there's not a lot of faith on the part of citizens in the political parties. They don't have a capacity in most of these countries to safeguard elections. They don't put well-trained poll watchers in all the polling stations across the country with good communication mechanism, targeting, and all that sort of thing. And even if they did, they don't have sufficient checks and balances through legal systems where they can take complaints and so on to be able to even this out in a timely way. So in a sense, there's a lack of public trust or public confidence in the integrity of the election. And interestingly, citizens mobilizing through civil society groups, what we call nonprofits and so on, have been able to more or less quickly in these countries help to fill that gap and to build a foundation on which some of the other things later have been filled in. We would go country to country. So probably the more important declaration of principles for election observation have to do with the global principles for nonpartisan citizen groups, which was launched at the United Nations a couple of years ago. The UN, India, myself, and others helped facilitate the global network of domestic election monitors. And they have over 200 endorsing organizations that have come forward. And the critical international organizations, the UN Secretariat, the EU, the African Union, and others, have joined in supporting this declaration and the work of citizens as election observers on the basis of this particular declaration. No surprise, it's a mirror in many ways of the older declaration from 2005 for international election observation. So what I'm trying to do, and where I'm going to round out here, is to say that for those of us who have experience in this country, those of us who have a rule of law background, we're looking at the question of electoral integrity through the lens of international human rights instruments, through the lens of the regional instruments, through the lens of international commitments, and at the same time, learning what those applications are in domestic constitution and law. And what we have to understand is the dynamic between citizens and their own abilities to be able to safeguard electoral integrity, and the role of internationals as rather constrained and limited in what we can contribute, but yet there are certain countries where that contribution becomes critical. And we'll tease that out maybe in give and take rather than have me pontificate about what you might do in the Dominican Republic or what you might do in Kenya or what you might do in some other place around there.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's I think, extremely useful to have the context, both for the Declaration of Human Rights, but also the plug for international election principles, which I hope Ben Griffin, who's with Griffin & Griffin in Cleveland, Ohio, will pick up on, since he also did a chapter, and if he will include the reference, he will also get some kind of nice gift from the panelists. If not,
hard currency.
yes, parting gifts. Ben Griffin is one of the leading civil rights lawyers in the country. Practices in Mississippi, has been the chair of this section of state and local government, is one of the leading lawyers in the area of the Voting Rights Act, maybe 65 and others. So Ben, as we look at the question of observation, particularly as we look at the video that's being used over and over again by the ABA's Public Service Department, what advice, on your experience, can you give us on international observation? And how did you, as a lawyer from Mississippi,
Two syllables, Mississippi.
get involved in international observation, realizing that part of your idea of international may have been coming to Richmond, Virginia? How did you end up in Georgia?
I do recall when the Republic of Georgia was being attacked by the Soviet Union and they were sending troops into South Ossetia. There was a frantic Atlanta, Georgia TV station that picked up on the report almost and said, "Oh my God, are they coming in from Alpharetta or Marietta? What has Georgia done?" And it took a little while to unwind that. I'll tell you truthfully, it was almost accidental that I got involved in the international aspects of election law and pre-election planning, pre-election observation, and election observation itself. I was co-chair of a Democratic Executive Committee back in Mississippi. The Democratic Party seemed to be, during the decades of the 70s and 80s and 90s, a dying party. I don't think it is now. But it was on that occasion that I had many opportunities to not only handle recounts and ballot integrity issues, but election observation in very great detail. My first recommendation, if you're interested in this area, get adept, get proficient at local elections, the ones that are happening in your backyard. Learn the alphabet of elections. I mean, it's not that complex, but it's by human nature, it's one that's going to be fraught with problems. Sometimes they're unintentional, sometimes they're most intentional. The other is this: to ease into the international field, you need a mentor, you need a guide, you need someone that's been there. I told Pat Merlot indirectly, he has served as a guide for me for years before I went to Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia these last several years. Jack Young also filled that need for me to have someone with great experience in working in election disputes in other countries. Jack literally would fly in and out of Afghanistan's Kabul's airport with a 2-inch steel thick seat beneath him. And I don't think they told him exactly why he needed that at first, but that someone later did, to avoid the shells that are being shot at you coming up into the helicopter and killing you. I think I would probably stop at that point and say, I think I'll go back home and do election observation there. So these two fellows, they won't say too much about themselves. They are two of the leaders in this field. Pat Merlot, just from the standpoint of his prolific involvement in election observation. So get a mentor, get a guide, someone you can follow. Here's how I got into it specifically with Georgia, Republic of Georgia, and Ukraine, before the first rock was thrown in the Maidan Square this past year. In Georgia, we had some very close friends that were affiliated with the World Jurist Association, which is an organization Charlie Ryan, a past ABA president, 1971 founded. And they've worked closely with IMLA, International Municipal Lawyers Association. All of these are organizations I've worked closely with under the tutelage of people like Dan Curtin of California. We set up, and at their request, were involved in planning for election law programs in their universities in Georgia. Suddenly I got a frantic telephone call, and Jack will recall this. It happened on a Sunday. And a frantic communication. We need you to come to Georgia immediately. We have serious problems. We can't tell you everything in email. It's being monitored. And I figured what was going on was a pre-election shutdown of their system. And it was very alarming, very alarming. And I also realized that FISA is a very viable statute, and I did not need to get involved in taking myself into another country and gratuitously getting involved in their government processes. But we did have the plans underway for a Georgia election law program that would address all aspects of their electoral process. And we did that. With Jack's help, we were able to develop, gather, refine data dealing with the election system, the problems that we noted, the anecdotal accounts that told us there were some serious issues involving government controls and government misuse of authority and power. To give you a small example, one example was, I've shared this with my colleague, was the area in which their National Election Commission, the committee, would have an operative call someone if they were donating money to an opposition candidate. And they would basically say, by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, we have records of your having donated $200 to the opponent. We want every record of your source of that money, how you came about it, where you earned it, where it was deposited, and where it came from. If you do not have that information in our office by 8 a.m. in the morning, you will forfeit your house. You multiply that by dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And the nature of those types of problems, which we would call in America, we would say oppressive government conduct. A legislator introduced a House bill about this time that laid all of this out and proposed factual findings that would make the skin on the back of your neck just freeze. You would say, this can't be happening in this world. Oh, yes, it can. And it was an act to basically express solidarity with Georgia, with their election problems and their governmental problems. Long story short, with Jack's help, it was invaluable. And what a trooper he is, because most guys would say, if somebody, even somebody they know well, I need you to go to Tbilisi, Georgia with me in 4 days. You know, that's a pretty big imposition on anybody's schedule, but he did it, and we were able to develop information that was valuable. We used it in the Georgian election law program. It's also going to be a foundational part of a chapter in the International Election Principles, or chapter or two. That book's been a very big success in the ABA.
The lesson you actually learned, Ben, was 2. 1,
Pay in advance.
get your airfare paid for in advance, and know where you're going to stay and get that paid in advance. Those are the only 2 lessons I think I've ever taught you that are useful.
Actually, it was very, very good. We developed at that point what I consider to be a good working approach to how to get pre-election observational information documented, how to get information that would later be utilized in an academic environment. We taught it at a full-day program. I had 2 Ukrainian lawyers, one now in New York City, one in Alexandria. Their English is impeccable, and you know, we have trouble speaking another language. You know, in America, we just don't want to get into bilingualism. But they were wonderful additions to the program. I had a Portland, Oregon attorney that was very proficient in a certain aspect of this. And I've dug into a lot of Pat Merlot's work, and a lot of it is online. It's valuable, valuable information about how to go about this process. Mine was from the focus and the perspective of pre-election observational data. How do you gather that information? And then during the election, how is it observed through the eyes of international observers? And I thought it would be helpful for you to have just a few suggestions on how do you become an election observer. There are some things online that you can get very, very quickly. One is from OSCE, it's the Office of Security and Cooperation in Europe. They don't actually do the election observation missions, but they have field operations that carry out election-related activities, including training for local election commissioners. The OSCE observes through its intermediaries elections in about 57 participating states or countries, and they do a wonderful job of it. The other is long-term election observers. LTOs, they're known in short, is that they basically are persons who have a long-term interest and commitment and involvement. I would assume, Pat, you've been an LTO for as long as I've been practicing election law or longer. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of dedication that's required to the rule of law. And your focus, I'm not telling you what has got to be in your heart, but you have got to have a love for human rights and protection of human rights to get into this field. Otherwise, you'll evaporate quickly, you'll burn out. If you've got it, and you've got what I call in the South, we call it the fire in the belly, if you've got that desire to get involved and to help and to participate, you can do work that will be complementary to what Pat Merlot's been doing for years and years. So you've got the long-term observers, and again, they are people who can be trained and certified through OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, affectionately known as ODIHR. If you can just remember OSCE and ODIHR, O-D-I-H-R, go online, you can find the short-term, long-term election observers training courses as an e-training course. Now, if you really get involved and you really want to be committed to it, take the long-term training course. Take it, plan for it, prepare for it, but put your name in the hat and say, I am willing on relatively short notice to be involved. And I'm not telling you, Pat will give you a phone call, you passed the test, come fly with me, but you can make yourself available and you're needed. We need competent attorneys that have a yearning to be involved in this area of human rights law. That's what I basically...
There's also a short-term course that you can find at osce.org. It takes about a day to go through the learning module, and at the end of it, there's a certification that you are a short-term observer. Again, it doesn't lead to necessarily running to the airport the next day, but I think it's a leg up as you talk to various organizations, whether they be NDI, IRNR, some of the other organizations that do observations.
Any of you who may be interested in that or think you may want more information, I've got it right here, and it will lead you to the website, but this has in hard copy form the short-term observation e-learning course. It's not simple. It's not self-explanatory. You can't just say, I'll finish this baseball game and now I'll go take this e-training course. You got to prepare for it. But it's not academic purely. It's a lot of social and governmental and political practical matters that I consider to be in the hardball politics of the international arena, and it's good. But I'm going to have this right here. In fact, I'll have all of these papers that I've alluded to. Let me hit Ukraine real quickly. Not like Russia is, but let me hit Ukraine. They are at war. We know this is happening over in the Donetsk region. We know what's happening. We can see it, and we don't know what's going to happen if there's an invasion or if there already is an invasion. I've almost got to take that out of my brain when I discuss what I'm about to talk to you about. We now have probably the third program. We've done one at Kiev University, one at the Catholic Ukrainian University, and one online webinar with the Catholic Ukrainian University. And we've got a fourth one coming up in November, which will be wonderful. It's not just pre-election training, it's governmental access, cooperation, participation. Good citizens trained, educated in their government are going to be citizens who vote and take part in the political process. That's a big part of what we're doing. So my focus there has been to help put on these programs in Ukraine. They've been very successful. We're all the time looking for participants, people who would help us teach, to carry us through some of that. Some of this is funded pretty well. I mean, you have to prove your ability to deal with it and teach it and prepare, but you've got to, a lot of times you have to foot the bill for some things out of your own pocket. But the LFT, the American Councils for Education, and the Legislative Fellows Program got a couple of us over there this past year, and I've been in 7 different programs, including 2 in the universities, met with their parliament. The minority leader of the parliament is now in the majority. We talked to Open Ukraine about citizen access, transparency in government, all the issues that are at the core of a fair election process. And in that audience at Open Ukraine was the current prime minister. Got to meet him. I had no idea, and he didn't either, where he would be 8 months later. That's just a snapshot. I can tell you that for somebody like me, I started doing interstate practice about 30 years ago, and I've been along the Eastern Seaboard, a lot of stuff out west, but the election law work that I've done has been in many states. To move from that body of knowledge to the international level is dynamic. I hate to put law practice in this context. It's fun. It is engaging kind of work, and when you do it, you find that you've got friends all over the world that are pushing and rooting for you to do it and do it effectively. The ABA has been heavily involved through our Rule of Law Initiative. ABA Raleigh was preceded by CELI, the Central European.
Central European.
Yeah.
Central Eastern Europe.
Eastern European Law Initiative. So CELI and Raleigh are just acronyms for what's basically the same organization. And I've worked with some of the CELI workers and now the Raleigh workers in Georgia. They are so anxious to get us involved. They don't come to us saying, tell us how America does it. We want to imitate you. They want to know what are the best practices. How can we make this better, honest? How can we give it integrity? How can we make it so that people will trust the election results when they're reported? To me, that's the essence of a good electoral process. I've got more, but we're trying to cut it short. We want to give y'all time to ask questions.
Okay. Jeff,
We're very pleased. That was the shortest I've ever heard you, but I was prepared for another. Anyway, Dara is with probably the leading Democratic firm in the United States, at least since they changed their name, at Sandler, Reiff, Lamb, Rosenstein, and Birkenstock.
When I went to sleep, can you repeat that name?
Yeah.
That's so long.
Used to be shorter and sounded easier to my ear, but has been involved in a myriad of campaigns representing candidates, and has a stint with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, working in their election protection program. And I think it's important to at least give us a comparative basis as to what Pat and Ben are talking about also, and as to what happens in the domestic situation as we look at elections and really election monitoring and observation. So Dara, it's all yours.
Sure. Well, first, it's an honor to be on this panel with these kinds of giants in election law. So, with that said, I think the principles in observing and monitoring and protecting in the states are pretty much the same: free, fair, and accessible elections. That is really the goal. But what kind of makes it different here, as with kind of emerging countries where their election law is really coming to be, is that here our biggest issue is that we have this series of incredibly difficult to understand election laws that change from state to state, and then even within a state change from county to county, or even within a county from city to the county. Often these complications in the law are so confusing that nobody really understands them, and you might have one election official who interprets them one way and another who interprets them a different way. So that really makes the job of monitoring much more difficult when it comes to training monitors or bringing people in to help and get a part of the process. So one of the most important things that we had to do in our election protection program, and again, it's a program with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. I'll say a bit more of that later, but if you're interested in observing, it's a great way to get involved. But what we had to do is really make sure you're of no help to any voter if you don't know the law and you don't know how this precinct is going to interpret that law. So we really needed to reach out and talk to those election officials and find out what's going on, what do they plan to do. If somebody comes to you with this kind of ID, what will then happen? What kind of training do your poll workers have? Can we have your training handbook? So if there's something they're doing wrong, we can point that to them right there. And part of that, again, like everyone else has discussed, is building relationships. In certain places, I think the voting rights community and election officials have a very bad relationship because of years and years of problems. And it's something that I think the community has been trying to build on so that you can change that nature and end up being helpful rather than hurtful. I kind of, at the Lawyers Committee, In my interview, when I interviewed for my job at the Lawyers Committee, I told a story, and it's really should be helpful here. On election day, on a off-year election in Virginia, there was an issue. We got a call that there was a police car outside of a polling location. Now this is an off-year election, so school's in session, the polling location was at a school. When that kind of thing happens, there are many different situations that can happen there. First, it could be that this police officer is stationed at that school. That is his job. Every day he's there. He is responsible for the safety of the students. His car stays there. It could also be something more problematic, and what we've seen throughout the country as recently as last year, where the goal was to intimidate voters. And there's rumors going around that, you know, if you go to vote and you have unpaid taxes, you're going to get arrested, things like that. So what you should do as a monitor is assess the situation. What kind of neighborhood are we dealing with? Are we dealing here with a neighborhood that does have bad racial tensions with the police? So if this was in Orlando, Florida, in 2012, that would be a huge flag for us to take pretty immediate action. But here this was an area that really didn't have those kinds of tensions. We kind of knew the election officials and knew that there wasn't big problems there. And school was in session, so we figured he was supposed to be at that school. We still don't want the police car outside because that's still bad for the elections. But how we handle it is going to be differently. Now, while we were making that assessment, there was somebody in our war room who decided to take it upon himself to pick up the phone and angrily call the person responsible for elections in that jurisdiction. And as you can imagine, that didn't go well with him screaming, "This is voter intimidation, get this police car out of here now." He was hung up on. So when we did the assessment right next to him, we then immediately called our contact there and said, "Listen, we understand this probably wasn't on purpose, but there's a long history of abuse here. Do you think the police officer can just move his car a few blocks away?" And that's what happened. And so those are the kinds of situations that you want to develop, where you have a good enough relationship where you can make those asks or talk to them ahead of time, make sure those kinds of things don't happen. So I think that's kind of the do no harm principle. And when we do observing, we bring in lots of attorneys doing this pro bono. And sometimes when you come into it, you're ready for some action. You want to see something happen there. You don't want to be just sitting in the room waiting for the phone to ring. So when something does ring, you want to jump on it. So that kind of goes to my do no harm principle of you have to make sure that you know what you're here really fighting for. It's not for yourself to get involved in this battle here. It's to make sure that the voters of the community you are specifically focusing on is going to have free access to the polling locations and to have their vote counted. I think part of what helps us with that is having buy-in from those in those communities. So for me to go into, a small southern county in Virginia, I don't fit in very well there. I'm from New York. I speak really fast. They're not going to respond well to me. I need people local to that county who know everybody in the community, who can really be that liaison going back and forth. And I think that's what, in international observing, that's also what you try to do, is have that buy-in from those people, those citizens who are there trying to help their fellow citizens have their vote counted. There's one of the important things that the community has really been building on is data and proof. So in all of the fighting over voting rights that's gone on lately, it's really hard to quantify what these problems are, and a lot of the information is very much anecdotal. And that has been some of the big pushback on the Voting Rights Act, is that, well, show us real proof. Yes, that county moved a polling location from a centrally located area with public transportation access to a former KKK, rally hall. But that's just one incident, so it's nothing. So what the groups have really been trying to do is pull together data that will help going forward, and then not forget about elections in between those elections, but use that. So after the election, when everyone has had time to breathe, then go back to the states, go back to the county officials, and say, we had this problem at this poll on election day. So in Florida, they had a poll whose poll books weren't working. So when a voter went there, because their previous polling location had been changed and they weren't on the voter registration rolls, they had no idea what to do. So it was, what kind of backup systems do you think we can implement so that next election cycle, I don't need to call you 10 times yelling and saying I'm going to go to the press if you don't tell these voters where they're supposed to go. And that has really been a crucial point in really helping make the system better on a small scale. It's kind of the things you don't hear about in the news, because again, it's not that sexy voter intimidation stuff that the papers really like reporting on. But this is the stuff that really makes a difference with voters and really kind of promotes these goals. In terms of observing and monitoring elections, again, the Election Protection Coalition, led by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, is an incredible place to start. So they have a nationwide program, they have a national hotline, and they have volunteer attorneys and law students going out to polling locations on election day, monitoring and reporting it all in. And then also lawyers staffing these hotlines. And what is really important there, and which was kind of alluded to with that do no harm thing, is that there has to be a clear system of contact. So when there is a problem, who is responsible for calling what person, and who is going to troubleshoot. And that really kind of puts this program to perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I think what we've covered in a general way is the sort of overarching ideas that observation finds its roots in human rights and in the right to vote. So I guess we are at a point now where we're open to questions. If there's no immediate question, it would be interesting, Pat, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience generally in what you do in observation from the time you get on the plane till the time you come home. And if you want to, a little bit about your observation of the ongoing audit and recount in Afghanistan.
Let's see if there's something from you all before I spout off anymore.
What is the impact of the new technology as far as the polling booths concerned, and as far as keeping track with ensuring that the various districts meet in with the compliance with
Yeah, that's a great question. It's country by country, there's a lot of unevenness in all of this. So if you look at a number of places, first focus is what we would call electronic voting. In a lot of other places, the focus is on biometric voter registration, so that when you go into a polling place, you're photographed, there may be a fingerprint, there are other biometric data that are incorporated into the voter registry. In each of those cases, you can imagine the issues that come up with how do you know that the system is operating properly. But this gives me a little bit of opportunity to roll back a bit, because in most places, I think it's fair to say, moving to these electronic systems changes the nature of the process itself, the relationship between the voter and the right to vote. And it's a public policy decision. So if you're in Indonesia right now and you're looking at the possibility of moving to electronic voting, when you know that in Belgium, in Germany, and a number of other places in the world, they have moved away from electronic voting. The German Supreme Court has ruled it out, for example. What you see is a public policy debate has to take place. So how do you inform the citizens, the citizen groups that have interests, the political competitors have an interest, the members of the parliament will make decisions, rather than seeing this as just simply a technical matter that the election administration takes upon itself. So that's one part of the answer to your question. Is part of what we do is to help flag these issues as public policy issues and help to facilitate public debate in different countries around them. Another element that it enters into is, so let's say you cross the rubric and you want electronic voting or you want electronic poll books in a given country. Then the question of the procurement becomes a very big question, because most of the countries we're talking about don't have the capacities to produce those internally. So you're looking at issues that have to do with transparency and procurement processes and the possibility of somehow negating financial corruption or other problems that may enter into it. I'll give you one small example. In Kenyan's last election last year, one of the things that they said they would have is an electronic voter registry in every single polling station. There would be a laptop that would have loaded who are the people from that polling station. The problem is the procurement for that, those laptops came from one country and they arrived late. The software came from another country, and given the lateness of the arrival, there wasn't time to load and then do the checks. The consequence was, in about 52% of the polling stations, the technology failed. That was a big hit for public confidence about whether this election was rigged or whether the election was clean. And in a country where the election before, more than 1,500 people died and 600,000 were displaced over the election contest. That was really a problem. Also in Kenya, the promise was made that from the polling stations, the head election officer would be able, through a secure means, to text the result. And that result would be received in the central computer, which would automatically be transferred to a screen, and everybody would be able to see polling results station by station, which obviously would take a lot of volatility out of the election. The problem was that broke down. So now you had two breakdowns in technology, and you had a lot of people being very suspicious of what was going on. So your question about technology has a lot of elements to it. The one element that I would say is, as internationals, we have these kind of comparative experiences where we can help various stakeholders understand why there needs to be a debate, what the timeline is for that debate, and then how you look into these various processes to ensure that the technologies are secure and they actually do their job. That's not something international observers can do. You know, you really are not going to fly into Estonia, where this is very advanced, or Georgia, where this is being discussed, or wherever, and be able to check out whether these technologies have integrity or not. But you can help the election authorities and the parliaments open this process up. You can help the political parties, candidates, understand they need to have the expertise on hand to be able to look into the software, hardware, firmware. You can help the civic groups understand that they have to get in on this and try to have the kind of transparency, checks and balances that are there. And then you can monitor whether that's taking place or not. And when it comes to implementation, then you monitor whether the protocols are being followed and whether the technology is actually performing or not performing and what the likely consequences are.
Yeah, I think that one of the benefits of technology is that it can provide better and in many regards safer gathering of election results. The downside is that when it fails, it can fail on large scales that go to the credibility of the election. And that even as we see in the United States, not every great solution promotes democracy. I mean, we went 2000 after the Florida election, we moved quickly to electronic devices, touch screens in particular. I will predict that 5 years from now, you will not find many polling places in the United States that still have a direct recording device, a touchscreen. That there are better, safer ways to proceed. So technology has its downside. In the Filipino elections a couple years ago, they went to a total optical scan system and to an immediate transmission of results. Partially successful, but still raising as many questions as it seems to solve. Because one of the things that we're also concerned about is how quickly we can get the results tallied, counted, reported, compiled in a way that has a chain of custody and security to it. In certain past elections, we have seen instances where polling station results get changed at an intermediate counting stage. So, I mean, there's a lot competing for the needs. And what's I think interesting about now the needs for observation is that we're seeing a need not just for people who have done elections all their lives, but we're also seeing needs for people who are dealing with technology issues, disability issues, gender issues. Believe it or not, the world is not perfect when it comes to elections. Neither here in Boston or in Botswana.
So far might be better off.
Florida. Pat and I were in Florida in 2000, and I suggested to him that if we could ever get one of these international elections to work perfectly, we would take that example and then bring it back to Florida as the true test of whether we could run an election fairly. Florida is different. I do have a question for you, Pat, and I do want you to come back to your experiences. But one of the things that we see, and it's different from country to country, Afghanistan, international observers can in fact complain. They have a right under Article 55 of the electoral law of 2013. But what's the role of international and domestic observers in preventing fraud on election day? Here's the example, Armenia. An international observer sees carousel voting. That's where people get on a bus and they go from precinct to precinct. Or you see, the thugs out there. The reason you know they're thugs is maybe they all wear the same kind of leather jacket. What's the role of international? Is it different for domestic observers in trying to prevent fraud? And the reason I raise that is Doris examples of one of the things that we try to do in domestic U.S. observation is we're trying to prevent events on election day, whether it's the harassment from the police or double voting. So how does that work with international and domestic observers?
Well, okay, so I'm going to do what politicians do. First, I'm going to sidestep the question, and then I'm going to come back to the question. So I think, in a sense, as lawyers, because that's what we have in common in this room, and what we're dealing with is a political process here, which has a lot of different angles and aspects to it. But what we're really dealing with is something that has to do with sovereignty and people's relationship with government. And that's underneath all of this. And so on the one hand, it really does start with what's the whole legal framework. And you're really looking at constitutional issues, you're looking at a whole set of laws, you're looking at political party laws, you're looking at media laws, you're looking at laws for incorporation and activities of non-governmental organizations, the citizen observers. You're looking at a whole legal framework. And a political dynamic, we all know that every law reflects political balance at the moment that it's passed. And that it almost, the equilibrium ends immediately after it's passed. So things are always in contention. One of the things we can do, and the ABA has been instrumental in doing this around the world, is to go in and actually test the legal framework and talk about it in terms of comparative approaches. Not saying here's the prescription, but here's strengths and weaknesses in all of this. And for those of you who've been mentioned this, there's a little handbook on how you can get into this kind of stuff with a checklist of 300 plus questions when you're looking through the 14 or 18 things, but which I don't want to carry any of these home, so if anybody wants them, they're all on the line.
And I could get that from NDI,
NDI.org.
called Promoting Legal Frameworks for
Democratic
Democratic
Elections.
Elections, or better known as the Malone manual in questions.
Well, Jack loves the checklist, so do a lot
I do
of
too.
other people. Checklist is appendix something or other. And and it came about for people like us doing analysis of legal frameworks, country by country, to give commentary and advice. And by guiding them, coming up with a set of questions. So that if you're new to this, here are the kind of things issues you could spot and consider. You can imagine how that goes. But you need to do that. And I've gotten involved in a project, I don't want to name drop, but I have to here, with Mr. Kofi Annan, when he came out of the Kenya mediation in 2007, 2008, when so many people died and displaced. He really was affected by that and put together a commission to look at elections, democracy, and security. And one of the things that we've been talking about is if you start with a winner-take-all system, Afghanistan being a classic example, the loser has every reason to try to tear the system down, or it becomes more or less a very tough fight, if not a fight for the death. Because if you lose, the consequences are you get nothing. If you had been in power, you may very well go to jail on anti-corruption charges in order to get you off the political playing field, not necessarily to go after the rule of law. There are a lot of things.
And that may affect your family, your friends,
all
tribe, your region.
So one of the things we are called on to do, and I have to say, this is American lawyers have a kind of global respect that we are fair in how we look at these things, and we have some depth of experience in how we approach these things. And when we learn the comparative basis, and probably everybody in this room took comparative law in law school or has thought about it, and you work in teams usually with people from other countries do this. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do. I just have to say that before I answer, Jack's question. Coming into the political context, it's a little bit like standing. Who really has a right to go before the judicial system or public opinion in a given country to seek an effective remedy for redressing what they think is a grievance? It's not us. Now, we might have ways of doing that, don't get me wrong, but first and foremost, it's the voters, it's the people who are contesting the election, and how to set up systems, help set up systems in countries where this actually can take place. Now, ABA, again, is very effective in going in, and so does the Justice Department, have some interesting programs to help the judiciary, to help the prosecutor's office, and so on. They don't specialize in the kinds of fast remedies and things that are needed in the election context. If we look at Mexico and their special election court, there's really something to learn from Mexico and some other countries that can move things along in a more expedited way. That's one thing. The second thing is political parties. Okay, I mean, in most places in the world, people say politics is dirty, and as a consequence, they don't really want to get involved. But the fact of the matter is, that's who's competing for power. And if they're not trained and organized in a way to, as Dara says, systematically gather evidence in a timely way to report that and know how to seek redress for that, whether it's an administrative remedy in the election commission or judicial remedy, then this whole thing falls apart. And Armenia is a classic example. If citizen groups have standing, in some countries they do have standing, in other countries they don't. But if they do have standing, again, their ability to gather systematically and in a timely way information and to come forward with that, that's a whole series of trainings and techniques that are needed for citizen groups. Not all that's legal, but at a certain point it becomes legal. And of course, there's the court of public opinion where this is all being tried before you actually file your briefs. So how do you deal with messaging and communications is really important. And then last is the role of the international observers. The problem is, in a lot of these countries, the international community, meaning the diplomats and the aid agencies, come first. Because the money that's running the economy is 50% or more coming from outside in donations. And the consequence is the influence of these people over who gets into politics how the politics is played out becomes exaggerated. And sometimes they pick candidates who they think are better, and they tilt the playing field unfairly in that direction. And usually in that circumstance, they're not very anxious to have international election observers around. Because what we've done over the years, and now, if I can, am I going too long?
No,
I'll give you another
I'm
less than
going
90
to get you
seconds.
back to my question.
Another less than 90 seconds.
Give it as long as you want, Pat.
We looked at this really then in the 1980s when Larry Garber and others were coming at this and said we have to infuse human rights fact-finding into international election observation. We have to have a credible way of examining these processes and evidence-based impartiality, bringing forward reports. That means, and that's, Larry Garber was my predecessor at NDI more than 20 years ago. And a lot of these techniques that the OSCE and the EU, I mean, we've shared lessons and we've grown up together and do these things very similarly. A lot of the international players are not so happy when international observers are there calling it as they see it. And there's some pushback on that. You can imagine in countries that are interested in having an open process, having internationals and citizens who can look at this, examine it, and speak is very welcome. And that's, the Václav Havels and the Duclerc Mandelas of the world. But when you've got the Robert Mugabes of the world and others, they're doing everything they can to keep them and us out. So back to, Jack's question. Way before you get on the airplane, right? You start analyzing what's the dynamic in this particular country, from the legal framework to the political environment to these sorts of things. You try to understand what are the positive and negative assets that are at work. And when NDI, which used to be, I used to be with a big law firm, now extinct, Heller in San Francisco, and before that sometime with what I think is still Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Wood, but Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Wood. And this was my favorite pro bono activity, going off with human rights groups and going off with NDI. They first went to the Marcos Aquino contest in the Philippines. And they got this guy, Larry Garber, who was a human rights guy who had spent his time at a fancy law firm in D.C., Arnold and Porter. And what Larry did when they went out was found that there was a citizen observation group that had come out of the Catholic Church Justice and Peace Network, and with some industrialists putting money into it because they were afraid that Marcos was taking the country down the tubes. And they realized that by building an observation that took advantage of what the citizens were, 100,000 of them learning around the country, they could better balance what to say about the elections. So what you do as an international observer is you start looking at what are the assets, who are the academics who you can listen to, which news media are going to be more partial or at least give you balance if you talk with several of them. Are there citizen groups that are doing this kind of electoral integrity advocacy? Talk to all the political parties because you need all of the input, right? You're trying to determine when they complain, because they will, they have to, right? If you're losing, you're going to complain. Does it ring true or not? And as Jack said and Ben said, you start with long-term observation. You might have to do this in spots over several calendar years, but you start months in advance with teams of people who are analyzing what this dynamic is. You honestly, all of the main groups, and we're all together around this declaration. We meet in the middle of the year, the key groups, the 7 or 8, and once a year with the 40 groups. We have working groups in between that look at things. We're not the ABA, right? But we're natural people. We're trying to improve our practice. What we do is we don't want the standing, to be honest. We're observers. We're not domestic actors. So we really, even when we're given standing, we're not going to go file suit. We're even reluctant to be witnesses. Our reports are public, and the reports are often incorporated into these things. So, does that get at what you were
Let
asking?
me ask you this question now, now we're in the reports, please, I mean, jump in anytime. Let me ask you about these reports, observation reports. Obviously, I think we all highly respect the final report that may come months after an election. But do you see any harm when you have international reports, preliminary reports that come out the day after the election, when the results are not known and a contestant to the election can actually use the report to destabilize the country?
Yeah, the answer is no and yes.
That's why I love you, Pat. Either answer works for me, I think.
No, it's both. So let's, and I don't want to monopolize because my colleagues here have got a lot to offer. So first, if you're lucky enough to be in a country where the citizen groups have got it down, they're systematic, they're fast, and they're there.
Mhm.
And that's most of what I work on. That's most of what NDI does, is 70 countries around the world over 20 plus years now, helping them develop these kind of capacities. So using Kenya's most recent election as an example, the margin, the statistical margin about whether there should have been a runoff, you have to have 50% plus a vote to avoid a runoff. Whether the election commission said that one of the candidates had a few votes over that threshold. Now, obviously, that other candidate was contesting this consequence. Citizen observers had a random statistical model across the country, very sound. We were there. We did the good housekeeping seal of approval on what the sample was, what the methodology was. They collected back data about what happened in the polling stations. Were people disenfranchised, or were they had a genuine opportunity to vote? Were the ballot materials actually there, or were they deprived? If they weren't there, or they opened late, was there a political impact, disparate impact by this, or was it random and therefore no impact? The vote tally, I mean, you get I don't have to go through all that, but you get the picture. What they concluded after 3 times analyzing it was the process was clean. And statistically, with a margin of error that was about 0.7%, the Election Commission's number was within the valid statistical range. And within 2 hours after that result was announced, they came forward with their finding. That took volatility out of the circumstance. International observers really then, they didn't possibly, as you said, you can't possibly know anything with that kind of precision. You can get a broad picture. But what the European Union and the African Union and the Carter Center, who were there, we all worked very closely together, and I work a lot with the Carter Center, they were all able to say, everything that we saw rings true to what they said. So in that sense, no, right? It didn't harm, because it was reinforcing something. But if you don't have a domestic capacity, and it's something that's that close, and you spout off your mouth without really knowing systematically what's happened, you are in danger of destabilizing the process. And in that situation, what I would say is the 4, 5, 6, 7 groups that are not mistake-free, right? But they all have ways of very carefully wording what they say to try to add stability rather than destabilize. And then this goes back to one, maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to do a footnote. Most of what you hear about in election observation, whether it's Florida or 2004, what happened in Ohio, or the recount in Minnesota, or what you hear internationally, what you hear about are the really controversial ones. And you, particularly in international observation, hear about the ones where there was fraud and it got exposed, or where there was large-scale violence. But most of what observation does is confirm that you should have confidence in what's taking place. The vast majority of circumstances really fall into that category. And what you essentially are designing observation to do is to build confidence to the degree that it's warranted, rather than designing it to be gotcha. We know about the fraud. And now that's a consequence. I mean, if you do it right, you get both. So that's why there's both a no and a yes.
And that plays into something, Dara, you talked about in the domestic observation, both with a nonprofit and with this fancy firm with, let's say it again, Sandler, Reiff, Young, Rosenstein, Birkenstock. There's no and between Rosenstein and Birkenstock?
There is an and between Birkenstock, but no commas.
Boy, you leave for one international observation, they change the name of the firm, kick you out, and take the commas from you. But what about it used to be Sandler, Reiff, Young.
It's so much easier to say.
Yes,
You're not in brackets, is that?
no, not even a comma. They took the name out, took the commas. But the more important point is, well, there's probably no more important point than that, but the important point here is in domestic observation, one of the things we're trying to do on election day is to tap down, is to solve problems. Can you talk a little bit about how that's different in a sense from the international view where there's more of an existential view of observation?
Sure. Well, what we do prior to the election is really promote that we're going to be there. So that does a number of things. First, it lets anybody who is looking to interfere in any way with voters' rights know that there are going to be people there that are going to try to stop it. It also lets the election officials know that we're there. Well, we all have these conversations with them, so they know that we're there watching them. But we also are always offering our help in any way we can. And in Florida, actually, there was a problem, and we offered our help, and they let us help people by using our app so that people could look up and see if they were in the right polling location, because their poll books were down and they couldn't tell people if they were in the right location. So, those are kind of two parts of it. And then the third part, of course, is to let the voters know that there is somebody here that can help them, be it if we have a monitor outside the polls, or if they call into our hotline if there's a problem. So we try to be very much involved and a part of this process, and really kind of view ourselves as part of the process. But when there is a problem, we jump. You make sure it's an accurate problem, as I said before. You assess it, determine the credibility, and then go forward and see what you could do to fix it as quickly as humanly possible, because that's a voter. I mean, I was on the phone with a voter who was outside a polling location. It was his first time voting. He was 18. He was there with his grandparents. His polling location had moved. There was a sign up that said, "You're at this polling location." Went to the new polling location. His name wasn't on the rolls. It turns out he was directed to the wrong polling location. He had to go to work. So he had taken that time in the morning to vote and couldn't do that. So we were trying to get that fixed before he had to leave for work. We couldn't get it fixed in time. And that was kind of one of those things on election day that still haunts me, that's a voter who couldn't help. But there are many that we have helped on election day, and that is really our goal, is to be a part of the process. The data comes kind of second to it when it comes to election day. Then after election day, then we kind of start kicking ourselves for not stressing the data more when you're combing and looking through everything that's there. Now that's on the nonpartisan side. On the partisan side, when you're representing a candidate, I think the dynamic is really different. You try to, all of your field staff that's out there at the polls knows about the voter protection number. They're giving it out to anybody that needs help. They're trying to fix the problems that way. But you are very much targeted in it. So, you know where you're strong in this day and age with the data. The field people know which precincts are yours and which ones you want turnout to be highest at. So if there's a problem at one of those other precincts that's not a strong precinct for you, and it might be a crapshoot on who that person is supporting, well, you're not running quickly. You might actually be moving quite slowly to try to fix that problem. Any candidate that I represent, I would never represent a candidate that tried to do anything to harm a person's right to vote, ever. I would walk right out the door. But, you know, if that's not a priority and something else is coming in, then, you know, on the partisan side, you have to do what's going to be best for your candidate there, which can certainly be tough. It makes it even more difficult during a primary when you have, you know, you want everybody in your party to be voting, but you know in these few areas it would be a little bit better.
You had a question, Ava?
No, not a question, more a comment. I'm from Austria, in Europe, not Australia, Austria.
Cusco.
No kangaroos.
No kangaroos, Mozart, yeah. The first time we had electronic elections in Austria, it was for students. And the Constitutional Court declared these elections void and null. Because it was not possible to check if they were correct.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key point which is against the electronic voting. The voting should be in secret and should be controllable. With the paper, people write and then it's in a box where before you look if something else in the box, you can, if it is not very clear, you can restart to count it, to separate it. In the electronic way you cannot, because if you push the button and somewhere is the result stored, you cannot repeat it. To repeat, you had to store all, and that means you know what the voter number 5 voted for, and that's forbidden. So I think the electronic voting is not the future.
I agree. One of the interesting things about this identification, and it's that it arises out of, I think, a misunderstanding at times, is in certain countries, you will post at the polling station a list of people who have voted. I think Venice says that's a breach of privacy. At the other time, the Venice Commission, the other side of it is that only if I can look at the polling list, know the number of people, and can check it, does it make sense? Armenia is a good example that both Ben and I have seen where, because of political and historic conditions, all Armenians have the right to vote, whether you are actually living in Armenia or living in California, as long as you return to Armenia to vote. There's no out-of-country voting. Well, one of the things that happens is that we, every once in a while, see ballots that are cast allegedly by people who are Armenian citizens, but aren't in the country. And so how do you sort through, the questions of fraud and the questions of secrecy? And it's a tremendously hard question because the cardinal principle is the vote is secret, full stop. And we struggle with this with videotaping. We want to have, for example, videotapes and video surveillance throughout a polling station, a polling center, but we don't want to see how a person votes. I think there are ways to do that. That's a way technology actually can help. I'm a big believer in biometrics if it works. It works in Nigeria, in a place that is otherwise has its own governmental dysfunctionalities. The biometric program has seemed to work. I don't think it would ever work in a place like Afghanistan, given that the technology needs the cost. So I think your point is absolutely correct about secrecy and process. And that's a lot what Ben chimed in, a lot of what observation is from my perspective. And I don't do observation. I'm not an observation guy. I spend more time with advising election management bodies. Is making sure the process has some integrity to it, because we simply can't be everywhere all the time, and we have to rely on process safeguards. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ben?
Yeah, let me add two things to that. There is a developed methodology that I think we're going to be seeing soon for electronic voting with a paper trail. We've been hearing it screamed for almost a decade. So I think the technology is about to be there. Now, how it's going to come out, who is going to be the primary sponsor or sponsors, vendors of that equipment is to be developed. They're out there. They're working on it now. Without a paper trail that would identify the voter and destroy the concept of secrecy of the ballot. So it would achieve that objective. It would have made the Austrian student, Verein, the student election, a valid election, I think. Because their biggest concern in Austria, if I recall that, I went to school in Salzburg, I think their biggest concern was it was not secret. It allowed divulgence of that information. Second is this, let me just echo the need for a rapid deployment force of election experts and observers. On the international scale, it's there. It's a State Department program, and it involves, I think, thousands of experts that are qualified, have gone through the vetting process, and they are available usually on fairly short notice. You've got to have a very strong composition and constitution to be able to go on short notice, but most of the time, people in the international election arena know where the hotspots are already developing. And this program through the State Department has been successfully carried out, at least for the last 14 or 15 years. And I think it's one that's extended to the Caucasus region, Central and Eastern Europe, obviously, and to the Central Asian countries where the State Department program has been able to function and operate. It's one that I think, carried to the extreme, is a very good tool, a complementary tool of having a rapid expert assistance and cooperation team that works hand in glove with OSCE teams of that very nature. It's called REACT in the OSCE parlance. In the State Department program, it's one that has, I guess, a fairly good current, and you keep the list very, very current, and it functions. So when you were talking about having the ability to move in quickly, that is so valuable. That's where I think even today volunteers are sorely needed, and it's a lot of times it can be a life's work choice to actually work in that field. So those two things are available. To get back to the whole area of methodology and refinement of the methodology for electronic voting with the paper trail, I don't think we're going to be able to see it in the 2016 election. I don't know if it's going to be developed by then. I worry about local election commissions being trained enough to deal with a new, and rolling their eyes when you say, we have a new electronic voting machine for you. But I think it's coming, and it will be on the election arena market. I think it will be there in the next several years.
One way you could help Ben would be if you would get involved in the ABA's Lawyer Citizen Program. You could be a poll worker yourself.
That's a good idea.
And you could find any sources you want to at www.lawyer.as.
Well, this is the guy, the bracket in the law firm right here. That's a wonderful suggestion.
Go ahead, Doug.
Coming from the editor and one of the authors of the second best election law manual in the country, that is, we've been trying to outdo each other for years. That is a wonderful suggestion. It was a program the Standing Committee on Election Law actually implemented, and it worked. And they've gone further than that, because the Lawyer as Citizen program literally inducts and brings lawyers into their local polling places. These lawyers, these men and women, know their electorate better than anyone. They're living there, they're practicing there. For the most part, they've grown up there or have spent much of their adult lives there. And it's a tremendous program that's ongoing. Jack, I would say it's going to be utilized in the 2016 election, hands down. I mean,
Brilliant idea, for sure.
You'd
think you could keep your name in a firm with an idea like that.
Nah.
Dara, go ahead.
Well, I'm also going to echo that. I mean, there's two ways that you can kind of understand the election process. One is to serve as a poll worker or an election official. The other one is to observe or be a part of a recount. That's where you see kind of the sausage making, and it is gross and it's a mess, but that's, you can see how things kind of all come together. But in terms of just the technology, I think, I actually think that other countries are going to have the technology long before we do. In part because here, we have a couple limitations. First, we have an election assistance commission that is supposed to approve these pieces of technology. The commission has no members, and while there are a couple that are nominated, who knows what's going to happen with that. But all of the states, we're actually kind of, I don't want to say crisis, but we are approaching a crisis with all of our election equipment. It's old, it's all breaking, and I just heard about a new company that's actually kind of developing this kind of possible stuff. No, not Halliburton. I mean, LA County got to the point where they decided to build their own election equipment because none of the other stuff is good. Some states are trying to get past these electronic machines because when they break, there's nothing you can do. The other advantage of having paper is that when you have a long line, you can just add another privacy booth. Just put a little corner, put two things up, and you can just add another voter there. Where with the electronic systems, you've got that one machine. If it goes down, you're down one more machine. But I think also, the types of things that are being tested out in other countries is a little bit different than some of the concerns we have here. I think our privacy concerns are greater than they are in other countries. So some of the stuff that's really exciting, the fingerprint, to sign in, there's discussions about taking your picture, but that has huge implications here. I mean, if the government has a whole system of everybody's fingerprints, we can see where that's going, and a lot of fears about all of that. But I think in other countries there are different issues. I know in most countries you do have to show an ID when you go to vote, or there are other systems to check that. So I think that's just kind of something to flag.
Go ahead.
One question.
Sure.
I work for the New York State Legislature, and we've been rolling out optical scanners there for probably approaching 10 years now.
Yeah.
And almost every year, including again this year, at the very last 2 days of session, we pass a bill to allow select counties or school districts to continue to use lever machines. Part of that is a cost problem, sharing amongst voting entities concerned. And I wonder, extrapolating that to the international level, how often are cost concerns a big issue? New York's probably one of the top 10 wealthiest entities in the world, and we can't figure it out. So,
Cost is predominant, because it runs the stream from Mexico. It spends a tremendous amount of money on a system and a court system to countries who simply don't have the resources. One of the great questions as the United States leaves Afghanistan is going to be, how do they maintain their electoral system given the resources? So it's a tremendous. Now, I think the New York thing is slightly different because I'm sort of a big believer that New York did the right thing in waiting. They didn't give in. Now, the fact that there are still Jamestown machines in New York, the lever machines, actually may be a benefit over machines that don't work, although there's been a fair amount of litigation over the last 75 years over sometimes whether the lever machines work, whether they're bedsheet machines, and how they're set. I've actually done some fraud cases involving lever machines when I was at the Attorney General of Virginia. Cost is always a factor. And you have to get it right when you do it. And there's a very small margin for error. Pat?
So are foreign entities interested in putting money into election initiatives? I'm surprised to hear Nigeria, I guess they have plenty of oil money, but countries you envision as relatively impoverished
Well,
Is that
it's a
right?
big this is a big international debate.
Yeah.
And countries like Mexico, which do have the financial resources, and Mexico really deserves to be applauded because they've done an exceptional job of trying to look at their federal elections and clean up the federal elections. Now they're trying to get that down into the states as part of an interesting twist in Mexican politics. Indonesia, and there are some others that have been going at this. But what happens, and Ben, maybe you should talk more about this, is vendors. I mean, this is a world, right? This is a globalization that is taking place on every area of economics. And people who build machines, whatever type they are looking for markets all over. So the electronic vendors, the vending machine people in the election world are out there. I mean, they have the money. They are going out. They talk to election officials in every country. They have a good sales pitch. There's an interesting company in Venezuela called Smartmatic that developed a good technology that has really stood the test of international and domestic observation in Venezuela. They're out. They'll give you a sales pitch. You go walk away saying, wow. Where they can start from end to end, run your whole election for you, and it'll all be electronic, and it'll all guarantee that it's going to be clean. These people are inviting election commissioners from all kinds of countries to nice places like Florida to look at their devices and so on. And you understand how that might work. And those of us who are into electoral integrity, whether you work at the UN or whether you're at an NGO or whether you're doing this from the rule of law perspective, are quite concerned about it. And I think a lot of these technologies are not sustainable in very poor countries.
And that's why you're starting to see NGOs turn some attention to the technology issue. IFAS, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, does some work with Stefan and Mike Yard in trying to work through the technology issues. But they're complex. It's adaptability, sustainability. And as Dara said, here we are in the United States. We spent $6 billion after Florida. And we're right back where we sort of started from.
Yeah, let me add this. There's an intangible aspect of trust and public trust in the integrity of some of these DREs that a decade ago were reputed to be getting beamed in instructions to flip the results at the last minute. The stories were legion and they were scary. And those have lingered. That you can go online, you can still find spooky stories about watch out for the electronic equipment. They can pull it at the last minute and change the entire result and you'll never know it.
They can really switch your vote though. That
They really can. And it has happened.
Yep.
But I mean, the entire industry was under that cloud. I don't think that cloud is dispersed. I think it's still there. And I think that is a public resistance to the type of new technology that I think is much more refined now. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's much more reliable than it was a decade ago.
My thing is, if you believe that elections belong to the people, it's all about public confidence.
Yep.
And in my, humble way, experience in this is, you have to have inclusiveness, and that goes to the voter registry, that goes to who gets to compete, and so on. You can talk about that in terms of fairness if you want, but inclusiveness, you have to have transparency. If the people don't see and understand what's going on, why should they trust it? You don't have to have blind trust in government. And you have to have accountability. So if you don't really have a rule of law system that's working, that can, if there's impunity for election fraud or other kinds of corruption, people will not trust this. The consequence will be a lack of trust in the government that results from the election. And that is really dangerous, whether it's an uprising, an insurgency that comes about, a natural disaster. If there's not a lot of faith and trust in the government, it's easy in a lot of places for things to come apart. Yeah. And maybe that sounds very simplistic, but I think sometimes having a grasp of the obvious can help guide. And those of us who sort of fly in this international community, whether it's Afghanistan this week or Ben and I in Ukraine not so long ago or other places, this is the message that you have to come across. When way before elections, when times are a little calmer, And I think, the work that Ben has done and that Jack has done in that regard with election commissions, with legislatures, with teaching people and through law about all of this, those contributions have really been tremendous. And I know as I've traveled and talked to politicians, because I do get to talk to politicians a lot in what I do, this work is cited to me. And I think this is the integration. You have to have a holistic approach to this. And I think that, these people have made big contributions, and this work that's being done in the United States is central, because if we don't get it right here, everybody around the world feels it.
Yeah, I think that internationally, I think Florida may well have been a crisis diverted in the United States through the acceptance of the Supreme Court's decision. I think Florida was a disaster internationally to standards. However, I am still waiting, Pat, for an invitation to observe an election. Here are my choices: London.
In 2015. June. No.
Yeah, London, Paris, and I might, and I'll go to, I'll go to Vienna.
Yeah.
Or Strasbourg. I'll go, those are my choices, okay? No more of this, Kabul, or, Abuja.
What about the Scottish referendum?
Scottish referendum, I would do that. I mean,
Weeks away.
I'm supposed to be right now in South Sudan. Anyway, thank you very much for participating.
Could I
Yeah, sure, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I must say, your last comment about the Jamestown boxes, I found to be quite amusing, because we're talking about 1607, and I'm from Bermuda, and it was a voyage going to Jamestown that got shipwrecked on the reefs of Bermuda.
Right.
That ended up later on 1610 saving the colony of Jamestown.
Right.
I did find that very hilarious. But I really wanted to ask about privacy and what happens here in the United States or the various states in terms of when people are in the ballot booths, trying to fill out their ballot papers, whether or not they're entitled to have curtains or what have you to guarantee privacy.
So you're not entitled to curtains, but you are entitled to a secret ballot. So in all of the machines, they have kind of these little wings where you can't peek over like that. But that's not to say, an election official can be coming up behind you and very well see your vote like that. There are also issues with assistance, but if you need assistance, you are entitled to assistance under federal law and state law, but that person, in almost all circumstances, will know how you're voting there. But there are these wings that you can help. We have had issues in certain states where people have felt like when they go to take their piece of paper with the obstacle scan vote, when they go to put it through the machine, they feel like the poll worker is looking over their shoulder and in fact has even said to them, "Oh, really? That's who you're voting for?" So that certainly happens there, but not so much when people are actually voting, from my history.
Yeah, the idea with optical scan is, ideally, is you're supposed to put the ballot inside a folder and then slip it in to the counter. I don't know about you, but if I voted, I got my ballot. Don't bother me with a folder or whatever. I'm going to stick it in, and I think there is some.
And everyone needs help putting it in because it spits it back out, and you don't know why.
Because from my standpoint, we only have 36 constituencies with a number of voters in each constituency, about 1,400 max.
Right.
And so we still fill out the box, put an X in it, vote the ballot paper and drop it in.
Right.
But last year, or in 2012, December, for some strange reason, they did away with all the curtains on balloting booths, and I was very alarmed at that. And there was some talk about it was done that way because people were photographing their ballot papers with their cameras. Have you ever heard of something like that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So what is the downside of photographing your ballot paper?
So if I walk into a ballot booth and I take a picture of my ballot,
Yes.
and I go back out, and you're the party boss, or maybe you're my boss at work, and you demand that I show you that. And in advance of the election, I'm told, you must take a picture of your ballot and bring back that picture to show if you want to keep your job or if your daughter wants to keep her job. And in a lot of countries, that is a real issue that's going on.
So,
But there is also something more troubling about it, the fact that the public wasn't made aware that those curtains were coming down.
Yeah.
Because that is something that the public needs to know why they're coming down and what those issues are.
tell you what I think the answer is.
I'll
The
go to-
four of us need to go to Bermuda.
I'm there.
You're most welcome.
We will divide all 27 of them.
Yeah, I'll be, if anyone wants to know, I'll be at the Cock and Feather, having a dark and stormy, but I'll be there for you, don't worry.
I'll take Georgetown.
Okay, we already got this, we got a plan already. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, that's good.
This is one of the frustrations of annual meetings is that, sometimes we have great participation, sometimes we don't. As you know, the ABA is dealing with a new format. I think this is one of our downsides, but the video will be available, and we're going to start with programs that we've done today and otherwise have the videos available on the Lawyers Citizen website eventually.
Yes.
So, again, to our staff director and to Jenny, thank you very much for all your efforts, and hopefully we'll see you over the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.